Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a special spooky Halloween edition of Dev Diary. Remember to leave a spooky like if you enjoy the video, and spooky subscribe if you're new to the channel. And make sure spooky notifications are turned on so you don't miss future spooky and non-spooky videos. Now, let's get spooky. So years ago, I made a game called Sweet Spooks, which should still be playable today and can be found on my itch page. Anyway, long story short, the player controls a ghost spooking kids into dropping their candy. And after finishing that project, I had this idea for a multiplayer spin-off, but having no experience in making online games, the project was shelved, locked in a spooky vault. Well, years later, and I'm nowhere closer to that goal, so instead of letting it go to waste, why not create a variation to just get the idea out there? And honestly, the idea is simple. Children, controlled by the players, must collect candy and avoid dangers, in this case zombies. And periodically, a ghost will show up to scare the children into dropping their candy, which can then be collected. The winner is the child with the most candy when the timer hits 0. Now again, this is meant to be a multiplayer game, but for the sake of this project, the player only controls one child and the rest are CPU. So code-wise, there's nothing too special going on. Player movement is our typical top-down setup, with spacebar actually allowing the player to drop a piece of candy manually. Otherwise, all children will automatically drop a piece of candy, assuming there's any to drop, every 2 seconds. Toss candies have 2 states, thrown and idle. The thrown state will fling the piece of candy in a random direction, eventually coming to a stop which places it in the idle state where it can then be picked up by the children. Now, the CPU version of the children are a bit more complicated. First, they will occasionally update their destination coordinates, but separately will also decide when they will move or stop moving. Then, using distance checks, the CPU prioritizes running from nearby zombies over grabbing nearby candy. If they are close to a zombie, they will enter a flee state and will remain in that state until they are able to get far enough away to reset their state. Otherwise, they will simply patrol around until one of those conditions are met. Now, as you may have noticed, when moving, the children squish up. I mentioned this because I wanted to try emulating that style that I've been seeing in a lot of indie projects these days, but as a side effect, a lot more was learned about how gamemaker renders stuff, which I'll get to in a bit. Now, if a child interacts with some idle candy, they pick it up, which means it's added to their candy count and the candy object itself is removed from the play area. And if a child collides with a zombie, they are placed into a cooldown state. Now, in this state, the child in question drops all of their candy and is frozen in place for a second. The zombies are also pretty basic in behavior, constantly focusing on and chasing the nearest child to their position, though they will try to avoid children who are on cooldown. And as this is all going on, a stage timer counts down 2 minutes. Enemy spawns, which uses a random gravestone as a reference spawn point, are increased at the halfway mark, which also adds the chance for a larger, slower zombie to possibly spawn. Once the stage timer hits 0, the game over state is triggered and a winner is chosen. This is done via a function that compares each player's score to the rest of the players' scores, and if they've beaten all their opponents, their number is stored in a temp array. And if that temp array ends up with more than one entrant, that means that the results are a tie. This is then reflected in the end screen itself. And I have to say, the movement for the CPU definitely wasn't very smooth, especially for the CPU players, who would often get stuck in corners due to their flee state or simply deciding to stop moving while they should be running. Honestly, given more time, these behaviors could have definitely been ironed out. For example, the zombies in particular are purposely coded in a way to give players time to flee after being on a cooldown, because originally they would just constantly camp the downed children over and over again. Now, in terms of features, the project is very bare bones, which is mostly due to it being, a multiplayer game, but not having people to test such a system with. But ideally, there would be added variation in the form of maybe abilities, stage effects, enemy types, or other random conditions. Things to keep it fresh and give it a ton of replayability. I did add a bunch of different costumes for the children to appear in, similarly to Sweet Spooks. But anyway, I also learned a bit about how gamemaker renders things, specifically why their built-in filters/effects act the way they do. And long story short, the application surface is very finicky when filters are involved, especially when it comes to using your own surfaces. For example, in order to get the squish effect when players move, the application surface had to be larger than normal. The darkness surface, however, is scaled normally, which, when combined with a filter, actually breaks all surface scaling in general. In other words, when using filters, keep scaling consistent. Anyway, the filter in question here is obviously the blur effect during the game over state, which is simply enabled and increased over time once the game over state is in effect. Indeed, a lot of headache and frustration for a simple yet not very pretty due to the lower resolution blur effect. Still, the knowledge gained in the process was worth it. So that was the project. Let me know what you thought of the concept. Again, it's very bare bones, so what would you add to spice things up? Leave any and all thoughts in the comments. And again, if you're looking to play Sweet Spooks, a link to the game on my itch page can be found in the description. But if you're looking to play some other exclusive games or get early access to the weekly videos, subscribe to my Patreon. With that said, brings us to the end of today's special spooky dev diary. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.